program, brought to you by Gary Allen Communications, was recorded in Pasadena, California, in early October 1973, just 1 week after the release from the publisher of Mr. Sutton's latest book, National Suicide. In bringing Mr. Sutton to you, we would like to give you a little background of him, as well as a statement from the preface of his new book, written by himself. Antony Sutton was born in London in 1925, educated at universities of London, Göttingen, and California, and in 1962 became a citizen of the United States. Formerly a professor of economics at California State University at Los Angeles, he is now a research fellow at the Hoover Institute on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University. Mr. Sutton has written for Human Events, the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute, Triumph, Ordnance, and National Review. Among his several books are Western Technology and Soviet Development, 1917 to 1930, Wars and Revolutions, a comprehensive list of conflicts with fatalities, Part 1, 1820 to 1900, and two forthcoming titles, The Soviet Merchant Marine and Collectivism and War. Mr. Sutton is married and has 2 daughters. And now we would like to take just one moment to read to you a brief notation from the preface to his book. The evidence and the argument in national suicide, military aid to the Soviet Union, will come as a surprise and perhaps as an unwelcome shock to almost all readers. It is a first attempt to penetrate what may ultimately turn out to be one of the most tragic stories in the 200-year history of the American Republic. And now we join the program as Mr. Sutton is being introduced to his audience.
I'd like to introduce to you Tony Sutton, Professor Tony Sutton.
Thank you very much, Marion. This is quite the most unusual layout I've ever encountered, where I have people on 3 sides. And I hope you will excuse if temporarily I seem a little vacillation from left to right. What I'd like to talk about this evening is my latest book, National Suicide, which truly is hot off the press because it, I think, is only due to be released this week. Now, it should be easy for an author to talk about his own book. And usually I think it is. But this one is difficult, because if ever an author did not want to write a book, I am that author, and that is this book. The book itself is a book of facts. There's an introduction. There's chapter 13, where I draw together some threads, some conclusions. But essentially, it is empirical observation, and in my experience, I've worked on this thing for 15 years now. Nobody has yet challenged me on the basis of fact. Nobody. And my visitors include visitors from the Soviet Union, from Poland, from the Pentagon, all over. No one has yet said Sutton is wrong on a fact. And if you ever hear of anyone, I'd like to talk to that person. Now, how can I summarize 15 years in, what have you given me, 1 hour? I'll do my best. Let me first go back 15 years and tell you how I came to write National Suicide. In other words, paint the background to this picture. And then, very briefly, I'll tell you what the book is about, and if we have any time left, perhaps I'll try and fill in some of your questions. Now, the threads of the story, I can pinpoint the source quite exactly. 1958, Salt Lake City. I was in a motel. It was a snowy weekend. I had nothing to do. I went down to the only bookstore, I think, in Salt Lake City. The only book that to me looked interesting was a book by Leon Trotsky. Probably been sitting there for 15 years because no one else had bothered to read poor Leon Trotsky. Well, I bought the book and I read it. And I was intrigued. Because Trotsky was writing about Soviet Russia in the 1920s. And Trotsky was in charge of foreign concessions in the Soviet Union. And I had never heard in standard history of foreign concessions in the Soviet Union. It's just not in the history books. This is where Western firms went into the Soviet Union and built the first 5-year plan, the second 5-year plan, and so on, right down to today. There's nothing in the history books about this. It was directly opposed to everything I thought to be true. Now, Trotsky, of course, is a communist. Lies can be truth to a communist. But there was something about the book that rang true. I knew, because I had a technical background, that you just do not build steel mills and nitric acid plants from scratch. There's got to be a technology. There's got to be a lot of technical work, design work, preliminary work. You just don't start and build a 5-year plan. Obviously, they got the technology from somewhere, so I started to dig into it, and that's a long story. By about 5 years, by the early 1960s, I knew that I had something which had not previously been reported. But there were gaps in the picture that I was beginning to outline. What broke it was I managed to get access to the State Department files, and I think they've regretted the day that they ever let me into the State Department files. And the story that I was developing in the early 1960s was that all Soviet technology, or at least the greater part of it, came in fact from the West. It was the product of Western ingenuity, of Western enterprise, of free enterprise systems. This had been blacked out, and that's very easy to check, because if you take a look at my argument, you'll see nothing about it in the standard history books. The Soviet Union was actually built by Western technology, by Western firms, and by Western enterprises. Now, 10 years ago, I was a professor of economics at what is now Cal State University, Los Angeles, and as you know, being a professor of economics beats working for a living. And consequently, I had quite a fair amount of time to spare. The students kept out of my hair, going a couple times a week and give a few lectures. So by 1966, I had the first volume written. It's called Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, 1917 to 1930. The second place I sent it to was the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. They accepted it right away. It was published in 1968. This, by the way, is the all-time, I'm not bragging, but I want to fill in a picture, because this becomes important later on. This is the all-time bestseller in the history of the Hoover Institution. Up to that point, I had not been able to get backing from anybody. I was even naive enough to ask the Council on Foreign Relations. I thought this was a research outfit, and they were very polite and said, no, we can't help you. So that was my money that went into that thing. But I'll give credit where it is due. Hoover Institution picked it up and ran with it and brought it out in 2 years. Then I went to work on the second volume, which was 1930 to 1945. I was still teaching. The last part of this was written at the Hoover Institution. Again, it was brought out very quickly. By 1971, the second volume was in print. Then I went to work on the third volume, which covers the years 1945 to 1965. That was finished 3 years ago. It was accepted for publication 3 years ago. It is not available today. It was scheduled for publication early 1972. If anybody wants to challenge it, I have the page proof, and I can send you a Xerox copy of the title page with the copyright date 1972. In other words, Volume 3 has been ready for publication for 3 years. It has not been published, through no fault of mine. You can make what you like of it. I just state the facts. So what I've got then are 3 volumes published at Stanford. They are a precise technical examination of Soviet technology and industry. I take each Soviet process in turn. I trace back the technical origins. I'm not going to bore you with it. But just to give you an example, I will take the iron and steel industry, the classical blast furnace process. I'll look at the Soviet blast furnaces. I'll trace back the origin to the West. It's this kind of thing, very precise. Let me give you another example. I know that exactly 68% of the Soviet merchant marine has been built in Western countries. I know that 82.1% of the marine diesel engines in these ships have been built in the West, and the other 20% were built in the Soviet Union at Bryansk and Leningrad under Western technical assistance, under Western license. They've got 6,000 ships. I probably know more about their ships than you know about your automobile. I know the cylinder diameters, the piston stroke, the model numbers of every diesel engine, every Soviet ship. I didn't get the information from Washington. I had to get it from the Soviet Union. A socialist country with apparently complete censorship. Now, you can be the judge, because what I did in National Suicide, I have reprinted the list of Soviet ships used to supply Haiphong, 96 of them. And the list is here, and I've listed the name of the ship and its Soviet register number and where the engine came from and who built it. It's all there. That's Appendix A. So you can judge whether I'm giving you a fair story or not. In general, then, I found that, if you want a ballpark estimate, I found that about 90-95% of Soviet technology came from the West. There is some Soviet technology. For example, medical sutures. They have a little wound stapling machine, which I think sells even in the United States. There is some, but not too much. Their best work, I'm not saying the Russians are stupid. Their best work is in pure science, mathematics, science. They cannot innovate because of a statist, central planning system. It is the system that stops innovation, not the lack of Russian ability. The Russians are just as capable as you and I. Now, my first two volumes were reviewed quite widely. Again, I'm not saying this to build up myself. I don't have to. It is part of this picture. Reviews from France and Germany and Holland, but I can't read Dutch, so I don't know. I think it's good because I know enough German to, I think I know what they're saying. Those from France and Germany are excellent. They're enthusiastic. For example, I've just read one from France which says, if all American scholarship can maintain this standard, then it is from America that we will see the definitive works on world communism. They don't know quite what the American academic institution is doing to me, but we'll get into that later. Those from the United States are much less enthusiastic. And, of course, those from the Marxists a bit sour about the whole business. Oddly enough, some of my most interesting visitors come from behind the Iron Curtain. And not one of them yet has challenged me. They accept what I say. They know what I'm saying is the truth. Now, here we get to the crux of the problem, why we're here tonight. By 1968, it was obvious to me that the Soviet military-industrial complex also originated in the West. Not only the economy, but the military aspect. And this military complex was integrated with the so-called civilian economy. Now, what they say in Washington is quite different. They say, no, there are two separate structures. You've got a military structure and you've got an economic structure. And if you deal with the economic structure, this has no effect on the military structure. This is nonsense. And I think they must know it. Because I quoted in National Suicide examples where the Soviets themselves say that the two structures are very, very closely united, and indeed that imports, the first priority in imports goes to military goods. But there's another point here. All military goods need industrial products. You don't just have a machine that turns out tanks. You make a tank out of steel, out of aluminum, out of nylon, out of plastics. These products are also used in the civilian sector. You don't have separate steel mills for tanks. Of course not. You just buy your steel from the civilian so-called economy that uses a slightly different, somewhat different specification. So your civilian, I call it civilian, your civilian structure is actually in any country the basis for its military output. And this is the core of the problem.